And welcome. We are in this series called Satisfied, and this is our third week into it. We've been looking at a little community right on the edge of what is modern-day Turkey, this little place called Ephesus, a place that the Apostle Paul spent 2 years in establishing the church, and then after he left, a young guy by the name of Timothy, who Paul had mentored, took it over as the pastor, and so Paul writes a letter to this church, which we see in the book of Ephesians. You see a little bit of the history of Ephesus, what happened as a result of Christianity really having an impact on that culture in Acts 19. And then you see Paul's words to young Timothy in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, which we're going to look at 1 Timothy this morning, regarding the issue of how do you bring order to this church, but more than anything, how do you bring order to people's lives? And as we've talked about Ephesus, the one thing we talked about is that this was a community that was not uncommon to who we are as a city as well. About 250,000 people, a little port community. You could have anything and everything that you wanted in that community. We knew that there was a temple set up to the goddess Artemis, who was the fertility goddess, and so a lot of sensuality, a lot of spirituality went on within this community, but also a lot of money passed this community. And so people tended to be able to get whatever they wanted in Ephesus. And so, even with Paul, when he writes these letters, he talks about the importance of certainly conducting yourself right as a Christ follower, but he also talks about your identity in Christ, which you looked at the very first week. You've got to get that under control. And then last week we looked at this issue of contentment and what it means to be content. And I want to hit on that just a little bit more this morning as well. But he also talks about this issue of how do you guard yourself and guard your heart against really becoming consumed with all the world has to offer you, in particular as it relates to this issue of our wealth. And so this morning, I want to talk a little bit about that. And anytime you talk about money, it always creates a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling within the crowd. So I'm going to take it as that it's not because the weather is cold, it's because you might be cold to the topic. So just warm up to it. We'll be okay. We're all going to be okay through this. Let me just give you the big idea for you this morning as we walk through this. And here it is. That my level of satisfaction, you have your notes, grab an outline as you came in. My level of satisfaction will be determined by how I am handled, not how I handle, but how I am handled by my riches. This past week, I spent some time, discovered this wonderful site called generousgiving.org. And if you really want to go and see some incredible stories, jump onto that site, generousgiving.org. One of the stories that I really was captivated by, there were several of them that I was captivated by, but one of them was by a man by the name of Alan Burkhart, or Barnhart. And Alan's family, his mom and dad had started a company that was really all about rigging and towing and that kind of thing is what they did. And so when he was in high school, he came to know Christ through an organization called Young Life. Anybody know that organization? And came to Christ at Young Life, and then he went off to college. And he really thought that going off to college, everybody kind of thought, well, this will probably dissipate a little bit, his faith in Christ will. And actually what ended up happening to Alan is that his faith increased even the more. He got involved with some good campus ministries. They began to challenge him a little bit. And he met his wife-to-be, Catherine. They got married. Came back home. They really felt a call into ministry, is what he thought. He thought he'd just end up on the mission field somewhere. And then his parents approached he and his wife, and they said, listen, we've decided to sell the business, and we decided to sell the business and actually go just start sailing around the world. We're going to buy a sailboat and sail around the world. But if you guys want the business, we'll give you the business. If you want to take proceeds from business, you can just take it, and you can go and do your mission work and whatever you're going to do and kind of do that. You decide what you want to do. And so they began to think about it. And they realized, wait a minute here, why couldn't our work be our ministry? And so they decided to take on the business. And as they began to work through the business, one thing they did is that he and Catherine sat down and they said, what's going to be our conviction about our resources, about our money? And that is that if this thing explodes, if this thing becomes big, we're going to end up with a lot of wealth. And so how are we going to manage this? And so they made a decision that they would actually do kind of reverse living. They would work towards living on 10 and giving away 90 is what they would do. And they thought, well, within the business, let's begin that within the business. Let's begin to look and say, what are we going to do with the business? And so he and 6 other guys got together and they decided to pour some time and effort into this business. And he said his first year, they actually profited $50,000. And they decided based on the profits, we're going to give the profits away. So they gave the profits away is what they did. And then the next year, the business grew 10 times that amount. And they said, if we did it with 50, we can do it with 10 times that amount. So they continued to give that away. And so eventually the business continued to grow and grow and grow and grow, and they decided, you know what we need to do is we need to make sure that we stick with our convictions of how we're going to be generous with what God has given to us. And so we're going to form a little charitable trust, and we're going to put 99% of the company in this charitable trust so that all the profits will always go towards those ministries we believe we want to continue to fund, and then the 1% will kind of control. And eventually they end up turning the entire 100% of the company over to this charitable trust. And it's kind of interesting because now the company's like a $600 million a year company. But Alan talked about this issue of living by your convictions and realizing that this was important, that he and his wife, Catherine, decided that early because they knew they were going to have kids, and they wanted their kids to be influenced by their convictions as well. So his son, who is now married, now working for the business, he told a story about a time when he was a teenager, and they lived on a farm, and he liked big things. And so he went to his dad one day. He says, "Dad, I think we ought to buy a Hummer." And his dad said, "You know what, that's a great idea. Let's buy a Hummer." He said, "Matter of fact," he said, "let's get 2. And he's thinking, 2 Hummers? Awesome. And his dad said, "You know what? We can afford 2, but we can afford 5. Let's get 5 Hummers. What do you think?" And the son knew there was a lesson coming on this one. His dad said, "Hey, listen, we know we can afford the 1, we know we can afford the 5. What if we take what we would spend on the 5, even on the 1, and we were able to come alongside of families who can't even afford anything close to that? What do you think about that?" And eventually he realized that my dad's convictions were beginning to become my convictions. Now, what stirred Alan to really kind of hold on to this conviction? It was a verse that he began to study in college, and it comes out of 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 10. And this is what it says. Got it for you on the screen right now. "But godliness with contentment is great gain." We looked at this last week, that as you pursue godliness, you pursue contentment. "For we brought nothing into the world, we can take nothing out of the world." Hold on to that thought as I walk through this message. "But we have food and clothing, and we'll be content with that. We'll be content with what God provides for us at this point." And then it goes on. It says, "Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction." And that little phrase right there is what grabbed Alan's heart. He said, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." Doesn't say money's evil. He said the love of money is. "Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." And he thought to himself, I don't want to end up grieving over what I've been given, and I don't want to be taken by what's been given to me, is what he says. And so he makes a decision early on in his life as a young college student that the conviction of my life is that no matter what comes into my life, I'm not going to allow it to control me, but I'm going to manage it in a way that's going to bring honor to the Lord. Now, how did he do that? How did that work itself out in his life? How can that work itself out in our lives too? 4 things for you to think about this morning. Here's the first one, and that is that you have to refuse to let your riches define you. Refuse to let your riches define you. I mean, as we said the very first week, you take your identity with you no matter where you go. If you step into that car is not your identity. You take your identity with you. When you walk into that workplace, that place of work is not your identity. You take your identity with you. When you walk into that home that you live in, it's not your identity. You take your identity with you. When you walk into that school is not your identity. Those sports you're involved in, they're not your identity. Whatever it is you're involved in academically, not your identity, but you take your identity with you. And so Jesus was very concerned through his teaching about this issue of wealth and money, that we didn't find our identity in what we possessed, but we found our identity in who we are in Christ. Matter of fact, in Luke chapter 12, if you want to turn to it, there's a moment in Jesus' teaching, which Jesus talked a lot about this issue of money. And in Luke chapter 12, Jesus is having a conversation with an awful lot of people who are really dealing with some issues in their life. In particular, there's one question that comes up relating to this issue of resources, and Jesus decides he's going to confront it, as only Jesus can and in the way Jesus does. It begins in verse 13 of actually chapter 12. It says, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. I mean, I want my part of this deal.' And Jesus replies, 'Man, who appointed me to be judge or arbitrator between you?' And then he said to them, 'Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed.'" Sounds like 1 Timothy, doesn't it? "Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Your life does not consist in what you have. That is not your identity. And then he told him this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain, and I'll say to myself, self, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Been wondering where that came from? Right here. And then he says, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with those who ever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. See, listen, don't let this be your identity. Because as we talked about before, when we kind of pursue things in this world to make who we are, we end up in some trouble. We find ourselves, as I've said the past 2 weeks, drowning in debt, crippled by comparison. We equate self-worth with net worth. Our salary grows, but generosity dissipates, it decreases. And what we end up with is this, and I said it 2 weeks ago, for the past 2 weeks, I'll say it again for the third week, and that is that increased relational and internal conflict over the challenges that we bought onto ourselves. That we bought onto ourselves. That becomes our identity. And so how do you stay within the context of a well-balanced life as it relates to all that God has given to you? Let me give you the second one, and that is that you live content with what you have. Live content with what you have. Now, I know we covered this last week, and I'm going to cover it again this week in a very short. I know some of you are thinking, but I heard this last week. But the truth is that many of us heard it last week, but we forgot it by Monday. Do you know how I know that? Because there are times when I'm in my office and I have to say to myself about Tuesday, what did I speak on Sunday? And I have to go back and I realize if I think that, you probably think that too. So I'm going to give it to you one more time. And that is this issue of contentment. Your contentment is determined by your pursuit of God over your pursuit of whatever, as we said it last week, of whatever it is. Whatever it is. I don't know what it is. And yet when we talked about contentment last week, what we said is contentment is about God's sufficiency, not self-sufficiency. It's not about me finding contentment in what I can give to myself, but realizing what does God have to give to me? What is God providing me with? Jeff Manian said it well. He said, contentment is a satisfied heart, a spirit that is alive to God and to others, whether or not you have or have not what you desire. It's what it is. And so we said last week that the road to discontentment was feeding your desire for whatever it wants. Feeding it for whatever it wants. And the truth is that as we feed it for whatever it wants, it's interesting because we can't seem to feed it enough. There always seems to be something else that he wants to be fed with when we're feeding it to ourselves. Matter of fact, that great theologian, Fred Rogers, and many of you remember this guy, and he was actually a great theologian. He was a Presbyterian minister who made a decision to not preach from a pulpit, but to use the mass media to give a message every week to the hearts and the lives of young kids. And if I were to do it right now, all of us would know the song, wouldn't we? I mean, there's a, you know the song. There's a, don't sing the song. And so, or it's a beautiful day. That's right. Is that it? See, I didn't even know the song, but I need to listen to Rogers a little bit more. But the thing about Fred Rogers is that Fred Rogers could have had everything he wanted, and yet he lived his life with a sense of contentment. He made this statement. He said, the older I get, the more I've come to believe that nothing I buy can take away my loneliness. Nothing I buy can take away my loneliness. I might think it can. Nothing I buy can take away my loneliness, fill my emptiness, or heal my brokenness. And so I would say that there's a lot of truth for this neighborhood right now on that, for all of us here. Because as I said last week, when we fall into this issue of moving away from contentment, there's 4 things that end up happening. And that is comparison, if I only had it. Compulsion sets in. I think I want it. Conflict sets in. I no longer want it, but I also realize what I do is I need it. I need it. And then complication sets in. Because then we ask ourselves, why did I get it? Why did I get it? Tell you a little side story. So I've been on a little journey here lately, and And so as we've walked through walking through this loss that we've been on for the past 3 years, and so for the past couple years, I've thought to myself, well, maybe it would be good to move to a new house and just kind of have a new beginning. Just kind of a new start, a different start, just kind of continue to move forward, but looking for a new house. And so I've been kind of playing with it a lot over the past really couple years and haven't really walked into anything. And then last week, I give this message on contentment, and about 3 o'clock, I'm standing in a house, looking at a house. And I'm thinking to myself, man, if I only had it, I think I want it. I could need it. And then I got home and I thought, I don't want to say, why did I get it? Just to wrestle. I'm wrestling with this issue of contentment. As you're wrestling with issues of contentment as well, because the secret of contentment is this. It's not what I bring in. Again, what did Fred Rogers say? The older I get, the more I've come to believe that nothing I buy can take away my loneliness, fill my emptiness, or heal my brokenness. The secret of contentment is not feeding me. The secret of contentment is to feed your soul for what it needs. And we said last week, gratitude. Being thankful for what God has given to you, having moments of gratitude, realizing purpose, that your life has purpose, that what God has given to you has purpose, that your resources have purpose, being able to walk through life with open hands, being willing to say, God, I'll surrender those things unto you as well, and then living a life of generosity. Just living a life of generosity, being generous with what God has given to you. It's so important. Martin Luther King Jr. made a statement, and tomorrow is that day when we certainly focus in on his life and his example and all that he did within the context of our country to turn our attention towards the right things. And he makes a statement one time in one of his speeches. He said, we all have the drum major instinct. We all want to be important, to surpass others, to achieve distinction, to lead the parade. And the great issue of life is to harness the drum major instinct. It is a good instinct if you don't distort it and pervert it. He says, don't give up. Keep feeling the need for being important. Keep feeling the need for being first. But I want you to be first in love. I want you to be the first in moral excellence. I want you to be the first in generosity. Why did he say that? Because certainly his example was Christ, demonstrating the generosity of God before each and every one of us. But he also realized that generous people are gracious people. And generous people are forgiving people. And generous people invite other people in to what is going on in the midst of their lives and others. I mean, generosity changes things, is what it does. And so generosity matters. It really does. So the third is this, and that is that you need to live as one entrusted and not entitled. Because what the world says is this. I'm not careful and I'm going to be caught up and find the harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction, as Paul tells young Timothy. The world says it's mine, therefore I'm entitled to do what I want to do with it. I get my it. I can have whatever it is. It's mine. And yet, what does God's word say to us? When you really understand this issue of money and this issue of our resources and what has been presented to us, we realize that it's not so much what I've been given, what is mine, but what I've been entrusted with. I'm entrusted with it, not entitled to it. See, when we live entitled with all that we have, what we tend to do is this. This is our mentality. We tend to say, it's mine. It's mine. And that's what 2-year-olds say all the time, isn't it? It's mine. It's mine. We become the owner of it. I'm going to own this. This is mine. Pride is involved in it. Look what I have. Look what I've done. Look what I've achieved. I did it. And then can come issues of anxiety. Why did I do it? Now I got to pay for it. I don't want to walk to the mailbox again. I don't want to listen to my voicemail because I don't want to hear the person calling the other line saying, hey, you owe for what you say you own, It owns you is what it does. And then becomes this issue of closed hands. I have to have more for me. But entrusted says, no, it's God's. It's God's first. That I am a manager of what God has given to me. That out of that, I will live with a sense of humility, knowing, God, you've provided this to me. that God provided it, and because of that, I can live with a sense of joy in how I manage it, and I will begin to live my life with a sense of open hands. Because if it's mine, I need to hang on to it because, frankly, I own it. Matter of fact, Matthew 6, Jesus makes this statement in Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. It's what Paul was getting across to Timothy, to those who were rich in his audience. Don't realize, help them to understand that what they've been given, that it's from me, but don't drive them to a point of caution. Don't allow this to take away their heart. In her book, God So Loved, He Gave, Kelly Kapak shares a story about a moment with her son. Came home from Sunday school, or Kids City, as we would say, on one particular Sunday. And so they asked the question, as they always did, so what did you study today? I hope you do that if you have kids in Kids City. I hope you ask them what they learned on that particular day. And he said, you can't serve two masters. And this really made her smile. She said, clearly that morning his class must have looked at Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one, love the other, be devoted to one, despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And then she says this, I was impressed with what he had learned, and I thought our conversation would move on, but Jonathan asked, do you know what a master is, Mom? Intrigued, I wonder what he might say. What's a master? And he said, owner. So the question really is this: who owns you? Who owns you? See, we've got two choices to make when it comes to this issue of our resources. One is either I'll be mastered by it, or second, I'm going to manage it. One of two choices: mastered by it, or I'm going to manage it. And so you have to make a decision how you're going to manage it. How will you manage it? One side is this way, and that is that you can come to the point of saying, I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to spend it, and then I'm going to give it. What's left over, I'll give. What is there, I'll give. But I'm going to save it first because don't know when a rainy day is going to come. You don't know when the economy is going to downturn. You don't know when the next recession's coming our way. I mean, you've got to make sure I got to save it. I got to put it away. I got to save it. And then I'm going to spend. I'm going to spend it, and then I'll just give what I can. Or you're going to say, no, I'm going to give first. I'm going to save second, and I'm going to live on the rest. Whether that be a 10, 50-50 principle, or 10-50-50, 10-40-40 principle. What does that add up to? 110. Did anybody get paid 110% last week? I mean, whatever it may be, 10-10-80. Gonna give 10, gonna save 10, gonna live on 80. I mean, you've got to make that distinction as to what that looks like for your life. You've got to decide that. You just have to decide that. And so there's a reason why we move to this issue of generosity, and that is that how you decide this really demonstrates your convictions. When Laura and I got married, one of the things we talked about was this issue of how are we going to handle our resources? How are we going to handle our money? And so coming out of the gates, it was a no-brainer for us. She was 30, I was 33. We had already set some patterns in our life. I was a pretty selfish guy, but yet we had just lived with this conviction of giving and of saving and of living. When I got married, a couple years into it, I realized we were a little bit different on these three. Because I knew that we were both the same here, but we were different in here. So I believed in saving and then living. And she was going, what are we saving for? Can you give me some balance on this, lady? And so what I realized is that the giving for her needed to be much more generous than what it was for me. And it challenged me. But it was a conviction. Her conviction began to rub off on me. Can I just say this? If you're not married, you're thinking about getting married, maybe you're 18 and you're thinking one day you might get married, can I just say, get this deal settled now. And then as you meet that person, you're going to learn a lot about them by what their convictions are too. So important. As I was walking through this week thinking about this, I listened to a story by a gentleman by the name of Greg Bauman. Greg and a friend of his, they were both Harvard business students, wrote a book called God and Money. And his friend John and Greg, they're still very close friends, very different from each other. They connected to Harvard. They were both in the business school of Harvard. Obviously, you go to Harvard Business School to make money, is why you go to Harvard Business School. But they were both Christ followers. They had that in connection. And one day they were in a study together with a group of friends, and some of the friends were at the seminary there at Harvard. And John and Greg began to think, we're taking all these business classes, but maybe we ought to take a class at the seminary. And so they kind of threw that out on the table, and one of their friends who was in the seminary came to them, and they said, hey, listen, we've got a class. There's a class coming up that you need to take. We think it would be really good for you to take at the seminary. Well, what is it? It's just entitled God and Money. And they said to themselves, we love God, we love money, let's do it. That's why we're here at Harvard. So they started going to class. Well, one of the things they began to work on was a class project, and the two of them decided, why don't we find out what God has to say about money? We know what we think about money, but what does God say about money? So they began to do this incredible study from the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament, seeing all the ways in which God talks about money and the principles of money, which came this book called God and Money. But the one thing that Greg and John do, and they're still very good friends, is that after graduation, they, because of a Harvard degree, they moved into fields where they were making a lot of money. And so Greg ended up down in Nashville, and he got married. And before he got married, they talked about their convictions of how they were going to use their money. And they said, we're going to use our money in such a way that it doesn't control us, but we're going to be giving more away than what we're living on. And they just entered into it that way. It's very interesting. He makes a statement. I just hope you understand my spirit of this. Is that there's about 6 of these young Harvard grads who are now on to their careers and making a lot of money, and Greg and John and the other guys get together on a regular basis for an accountability group. As men have accountability groups. Greg made the statement. He said, the one thing we lay out there is we lay out how we handle our money. He said, it's very interesting. Men get together and they find it easy to talk about things like pornography. But he said, it's a much different story when they start talking about issues of their finances. Because it matters. It matters. How are you managing that? The fourth is this, and then we're done. Everybody doing okay? So we'll make sure we're doing okay. Everybody okay? Here's the last, and that is live with eternity in mind. Live with eternity in mind. Paul goes on in verses 17 through 19. Listen to what he says, because if you studied at all what Jesus says about money, this is going to sound like the Gospels coming into Timothy here. It says, verse 17, command those who are rich in their present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds. He says, listen, let your goodness go beyond just your finances. He says, be rich in good deeds and be generous and willing to share. Don't live like this. He says, live like this. And in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of life that is truly life. When you die, what are you going to leave behind? You're going to leave behind all of it. Every bit of it. And yet we live in our culture and our society driven by this issue of money. If the economy's going well, we're happy. If the economy's not going well, we're sad. We think the world is spinning out of control. And that's because we are self-sufficient and not living God-sufficient. But when you die, Paul is saying you're going to leave it all behind. So make sure that you're investing into the future. Make sure you're investing in the kingdom. This morning, when we saw these baptisms here this morning, and the baptisms we saw at first service, every time I see a baptism, every time I get to experience those baptisms, I sit back and I think to myself, I am so thankful, God, for the privilege that you've given me and that you've given us to be a part of a church where those kinds of stories are being shared on a regular basis. Aren't you? Aren't you? I hope you are. And so we're all able to invest in that kind of thing. Lives being changed for all of eternity. Kingdom work being done that impacts all of eternity. See, you miss your money. I'll tell you when you miss your money. You miss your money when you waste it. Why did I waste my money on that? When you spend it, when you poorly invest it, should not have bought those stocks. I knew I should have invested in that company. Or when you loan your brother-in-law money, you miss it because you know it's not coming back. But let me just kind of put this all in perspective. We think about this issue of our response to God. What you need to understand is that God is a giver. He's not a taker. Just one verse. Most of you in this room probably know this verse. For God so loved the world that he gave. Yeah, he gave his only. He gave. He's a giver. He's not a taker. And yet, so oftentimes, we want to hold back a little bit on what we've been given. God gave. Matter of fact, we are told that we are to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. That giving brought joy to the very heart of God. When Jesus gave his life for you and for me, for the joy set before him endured the cross. The joy of knowing that this work was going to pay for the penalty of those sins, to bring redemption into people's lives, into those that I love, and those that I created, and those I long to redeem. I mean, for the joy set before him. And so it's interesting because when it comes to this issue of our resources, we just think it's ours, and yet how do we respond in a joyful way? Paul says in 2 Corinthians 9, he says, so let each one give as he has purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful or a hilarious giver. Now, I said last week, it'd be kind of weird if when we took the offering, everybody started laughing. That'd be a little strange at that point. But wouldn't it be something if when we took the offering, everybody started applauding or cheering? Boy, that went over well, didn't it? Just give you a little insight on this one. When I'm at a banquet and I get to write a check, I've never done that grudgingly. I guess I better do something here. It's always cheerfully. God, thank you for what you've given. Every other week when I get paid and I send that out, I never send it out grudgingly. I don't even think about it. God, thank you for what you've given. When you're able to give out of what God has given to you, it should well up in you a sense of just cheerfulness, of joy, a sense of celebration, because every time you do that, it takes the focus off what I get to what I've been given. It changes the question. It's not about what's mine. It's about, God, look what you've given to me to manage. Randy Alcorn said it well. He said, it's living with the awareness that we are managers, not owners, that we are caretakers of God's assets, which he has entrusted to us for this brief season here on earth. He says, how we handle money and possessions demonstrates who we really believe is their true owner, God or us. And see, when it comes to what you have, 1 Chronicles makes it very clear. Everything comes from you, God, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. And so, in this issue of generosity, what ends up happening is that we take ourselves out of first place and we put God in his rightful place. Someone said so well, that when God gets your money, he gets your heart, and you move from me to we, from mine to God's heart. And then what ends up happening is that your heart begins to look a little bit more like God's heart, because God's a generous God. and you find yourself more deeply connected to the generosity of God every time you respond with a joyful, cheerful stance of being generous with all that God has given to you. You've been given much. I've been given much. Been given much. And God, we want to give you much back. We want to be good managers of all that you've entrusted to us. Let's stand together, shall we? This is not only Martin Luther King weekend, this is also Sanctity of Life Sunday, and we value that around here. We value the fact that, God created all of us in his image, fearfully and wonderfully made. And I want to pray about that this morning as well. And just for all of us as a church. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for the examples that you've given to us. Someone like a Martin Luther King who changed the focus of our nation, who was willing to put his life on the line, to be generous with his life and with his calling. And to this day, we are not the same because of it. We have a long ways to go, but we're different. Lord, I think about the reality of what this Sunday is as well, Sanctity of Life Sunday, and of the stories of hurt and loss and pain that's encompassed in all that as well, and hope. And I pray that as a church, you would just continue to remind us of the importance of life, the value of life, that every human life matters to you. And that those that are in this room this morning, that even as we talk about and pray about this today, that there may be just a tinge of pain in their life and hurt because of what this day reminds them of. I pray you give them the courage to maybe reach out to someone, the courage to call a place like a Hope Center and just say, I need to continue to get my heart in a healthy place. Lord, I thank you for all the resources that are sitting in this place right now. And for us as a church, you've given us the ability to be generous as a church. Not only to those inside, but to those outside. I think of those individuals in this church this morning that when they hear this message, they think to themselves, but I have to depend on others right now in my life. And Lord, I am so thankful that they're willing to say they are not self-sufficient, but they need you. And that we as a church, that we get to come around them and we get to love them as you would have us love them, Jesus. We get to be your hands and your feet. We get to speak truth and life and love into their lives. And for the rest of us, Lord, I pray that you would help us to walk out of this place thinking about all that we've been given. Our gifts and our talents and our abilities and our resources. And that, Lord, you would just continue to allow us, just walk us through this week, challenging us with our convictions about those things that we possess. May you be first in all things. We love you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. See you later, everybody. Have a great week.